My name's Alec Resnick, and we're at Sprouts Studios in Somerville. And Sprouts is an educational nonprofit that's kind of focused on bringing science and investigation into people's everyday lives in one way or another. I think one way we talk about what we're trying to do is make a community college that lives up to its name. Meaning not a college in a community or a school in a building, but a community of people that relate collegially to investigate questions that they care about. And so this is our studio space, and downstairs we have some light manufacturing equipment, basic power tools and a bike setup. And then over here we have a burgeoning library and study space that's so far been used for classes, but will soon be turned into kind of a little bit of a community cafe as well. So we just got all the books cataloged, and people have been starting to borrow them and all that sort of stuff. There are very few types of relationships to science. You can be like, you hated it in school and you're kind of afraid of it, or like you're interested in it, but you don't really have any opportunities to engage with it really, so you might like read popular science or listen to podcasts or whatever, but you don't necessarily run into lots of opportunities to be creative with it, to be a producer of it, or you do it professionally in some capacity. We're trying to kind of organize the maybe community-driven version of a school, except for the fact that usually the way people interact with this school is they say, you know, I want to learn X and I'm going to go to you to get this. And I think the message we want to communicate is that for lots of things that are really interesting to look into and a lot of your educational quote-unquote needs, your community is a really rich and latent and kind of untapped resource. Because I think a lot of people have lots of coherent interests, but maybe find it hard to say, like, okay, I'm going to sit down with a textbook, you know, for 2 hours every other day and read this thing. But when they have the structure of I'm teaching a class on this thing, it's much easier for them to wrap their head around what it means to organize their time to learn stuff and to produce things that they're interested in. So right now we offer lots of programs, but we'd actually like to move beyond those, and not in the sense of leaving them behind, but in the sense of adding to them and starting to offer people the opportunity to say, I'm really interested in X and I would like to pursue it or research it, and to do that I need some mix of like financial support and connections to local companies that might be able to help me out either through sponsorship or because they have access to a lot of expertise that's relevant. Maybe kind of putting together the community-driven analogs of things like the NSF in the university world, where somebody says, you know, the investigation you're doing is valuable, here's money to give you time to do that. And so as opposed to just giving somebody a pile of money, working with them to put together maybe a community-driven package to give them both mental and temporal space to work on the stuff they're interested in. And the hope is that we'll be able to start talking about what it means to have a community of people who are providing kind of for their own educational needs. Lots of people organize book clubs, or people will organize like meetups around a certain skill, but I feel like there are not very many examples of people organizing like broader or longer term or deeper investigation into hard sciences or technical fields. There are a few like great counterexamples, like the open source community is an obvious one where there's lots of infrastructure that's very non-traditional to get people up and running in terms of computer science and programming skills, and nobody takes for granted that you need a CS degree to get involved as a professional programmer in any capacity. I think a lot of times when people talk about education, and especially even alternative education, they start off with this built-in assumption that education is kind of like, you know, cough medicine of one form or another, and that the real work is figuring out how to like get people to swallow it without being too unhappy about that. And there are like different approaches to that, and I think that we kind of want to reject that at the outset and say, actually, we think that education happens all the time. People are constantly learning stuff, and that people have really robust and powerful ways of organizing their own education when they aren't necessarily programmed to assume ahead of time that they aren't able to do it. So like nobody's worried about the lack of music education translating into, you know, we're going to run out of hit singles next year or something like that. Part of what we want to move towards is trying to make the claim that education is not only a community function, but also something that reinforces and builds community, organizing community around the production and creative output of people, especially in directions or fields that they're interested in, and that leave them in maybe like a more empowered position to do things that they care about in the future, is something that we're really engaged by. I think people really discount the kind of social or affective components of kind of what the necessary ingredients for successful education are. The movie industry puts in a lot of work to make your movie viewing experience pleasurable, and if you compare that to how much effort people put into making lecture experiences pleasurable, there's like this enormous gap, right? The assumption is that the onus is on the person who's watching the lecture to get something out of it. I think that translates more broadly into the fact that people don't really recognize or aren't even necessarily aware of the power of a group of people who are authentically interested in something getting together and working on it. I feel like a lot of the problems that people talk about in education are problems kind of our own creation, of like lack of motivation or lack of interest, and all of these things that stem from giving people, you know, problems that they're not so interested in an environment where they don't really have alternative choices. Nobody ever, you know, is worried again about like people losing interest in music. But for us, making the claim that a community doesn't need to go somewhere else for its own education, and going beyond that would actually be really engaged by organizing its own education, is a big piece of what we want to end up communicating. We just benefit a lot from having kind of a good, you know, turmoil of interesting people and ideas around, and that kind of stuff is only available if you're willing to back off of a certain amount of structure and say like our space is open, or like our programs are open to anyone, rather than have, you know, lots of people doing science one way. We would rather have like a few people doing high quality, you know, education in science, but in a very broad set of ways. Like we want to increase the number of genres of science or whatever. When you're looking for that type of like healthy creativity and divergent thinking, it's hard to get it in like a top-down planned way. I think it is, has at least for us proven a lot more successful to aim to be just open and receptive, and to think of our role as trying to build like a healthy community that's going to have subcultures and sub-interests, starting with the ingredient of a community of people who are like interested in each other and interested in things that they'd like to share or learn together, has helped us get a lot of the momentum that we have now, that I think we would have missed out on had we said, you know, we think it should be done like A, B, and C. Here are the courses that we offer. You can come and take them, right? Where instead it's much more of a conversation, like not even between us and our community, but a conversation among the community. I think we want to work towards not necessarily differentiating, you know, ourselves or Sprout so much from the people who are interested in the stuff that we're doing.